Thank you, everybody, for being on the line. Thank you, President Jin Liqun from the AIIB, for being with us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. We met now nearly a decade ago when you were at the Sovereign Fund of China, and before that you were at CICC, the investment bank. For now, more than 5 years, you've been heading up this pioneer institution, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And I remember very well when you came to London and told us about this in 2014, we were quite skeptical, I have to say, whether you would actually succeed. Well, you were right, and we skeptics were wrong, because you managed to bring this new institution up and running. And I'm looking forward to you saying a few words about the achievements that you've had, particularly in the light of the COVID crisis, what you're doing on the infrastructure front. And then we will be having a conversation also about some of the wider multilateral aspects, which are becoming more and more important, given the somewhat fraught relationship between China and the United States. But first of all, many congratulations on being given a second 5-year term. And over to you now, President Jin, to say a few opening words before we get into a conversation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great privilege and pleasure to be invited to the official Monetary and Financial Institutions Forum. And I would like to thank you, Chairman David Marsh, and your team for extending this gracious invitation. Today, we convene against a backdrop of uncertainty, having emerged from a year that brought about unprecedented disruption to business and to the people's daily lives. 2021 arrived with good tidings of success in vaccine production. Mass vaccinations are underway in a number of countries. This breakthrough demonstrates what can be achieved through international collaboration, commitment, and global solidarity in the face of global crisis. With this glimmer of hope in sight, we at AIIB have asked ourselves, what kind of the world should we be rebuilding? What role should AIIB play in creating that vision? This year, our bank commemorates our 5th year of operations. Having started in 2016 with 57 countries, today we have 103 members across the globe and have invested in 112 projects, totaling over $23 billion. We have consistently received AAA ratings from the top credit rating agencies, which is an industry recognition of our sound financial standing. We're exceptionally pleased with our response to the needs of our members during the pandemic. Under AIIB's COVID-19 Crisis Recovery Facility, CRF, a total of 27 projects amounting to over $7 billion was approved to help 19 members navigate these highly uncertain times. And we continue to support our members to stave off the worst effects of the pandemic. We look forward to ramping up business post-COVID-19. We have identified 5 key trends which we believe will be important drivers of the recovery in the coming years. The first trend is that healthcare is the weakest link in the global economy. Greater and more strategic investments in the health sectors are needed if we are to safeguard ourselves against the next pandemic. A healthy nation is a productive nation. The second trend is enhanced investments in climate change mitigation. This also calls for financing for the transition to carbon neutrality. It is gratifying to see global efforts toward this direction. For our part, AIIB has set an ambitious target of ensuring that 50% of our approved financing by 2025 will be directed towards climate finance. The third trend is the use of technology as a result of COVID-19. In fact, digital-related sectors have been the biggest winners of the pandemic. The health crisis has changed the way we work, study, and live. The fourth trend is the privatization of assets by cash-strapped governments to close the financing gap exacerbated by the crisis. The role of an MDB like ours is to uncover new financing and risk-sharing models to entice more private sector organizations to enter the sector in emerging markets. This is why we are aiming at 50% of our bank's approved financing to be in the private sector by 2030. The fifth trend represents a mixed view for trade and supply chains. We believe in globalization and its broad benefits for all the parties involved. Opportunities abound for investments in connectivity and cross-border infrastructure. New infrastructure development boosted by new technology will bring forth immediate benefits and pay off in the long term. Global trade will eventually open up, and countries that invest smartly will be ready to capitalize on those opportunities. 5 years ago, we started a bank that was to be part of the MDB gene pool, but one with new features. 5 years on, our efforts continue, but ambition has grown. As I begin my second term, I believe that our bank's investments must continue to evolve. We should not copy what has already been done. We will chart a new path we call the infrastructure for tomorrow. This is green infrastructure with sustainability, innovation, and connectivity, all intricately intertwined at its core. This is our new mission. By investing in infrastructure for tomorrow, we will unlock new capital, new technologies, and new ways in which we address climate change and connect Asia internally and with the rest of the world. At this point, I'm happy to take questions to clarify any of the points I've just shared with you. Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
Yes, thank you, President Jin. I remember when you started off on this journey, you made a lot about the commitment to lean and green and clean. Lean, you said the governance was going to be quite exemplary, also in terms of costs, just compared with institutions you know very well, like the World Bank and the African Development Bank and the Asia Development Bank. Can you tell us how you have achieved a greater value for money out of this more lean governance structure that you have?
Thank you, David. Let me share with you my thoughts. Being lean is very much important. For a new institution created in the 21st century, I have highlighted on many occasions that we should avoid institutional obesity. We should keep fit, stay lean, because this is important for us to avoid bureaucracy, minimize the red tape, to be most cost effective. I would like to build a bank which can depend on its own capacity to expand its capital base without knocking on the doors of shareholders asking for capital increase again and again and again. We appreciate very much the support of our founding members and the new members at a time when a lot of these countries were grappling with their own financial troubles, were grappling with the budget problems, and particularly, for instance, European countries, in the wake of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. All those governments were really hot up, but they supported the bank. They gave us capital. As you see, we have $100 billion as registered capital, 20% paid in. So I asked myself at the very beginning when we tried to set up this bank, are we going to repeat the same pattern of capital increase? Now, please understand, this is no reflection on the existing institutions. Those institutions were built 7 decades ago, half a century ago, or 30 years ago, in a very different environment, under slightly different governance structure. Now, as a newcomer, we must be able to pick up what is the plus and avoid what is minus. For instance, in a digital era, could we be more cost effective? And one of the most important features, we don't have the resident board. We don't have the resident executive board. We can save costs by about 20%. But more importantly, it's not an issue of cost effectiveness. It's also a clearer division of responsibility between the management and the board. The board should not micromanage. The board should focus on the major issues, policies, strategies, and the management should run the bank on a daily basis. But to have this new governance structure, we made a firm commitment to the board. The management, the president, are held accountable for any of the problems. So there's a high level of, I would say, trust because of this new structure. So being lean is vitally important. And I would like to make sure that this new MDB, while staying in the gene pool of the MDBs, should really have its new features as the bank created in the 21st century.
I think you're quite modest by saying you don't want to actually give lessons to the existing institutions which were formed many years ago in different circumstances. Nonetheless, I do think that there will be some people who look at this and say, well, look, if I can save 20% of my costs by having a leaner structure, I would like to do that. I do remember there was some furious rows 6 or 7 years ago, particularly between the American government and the British government. To a certain extent, the Germans were involved in this. The Americans thought that this was going to be a China-dominated institution, and the British were being naive and foolish by joining up. And there was considerable dissent on this, wasn't there? Now, Mr. Biden may have other priorities, but are you still keeping a seat warm for the United States should they decide in coming years to join?
You know, this is always the decision of a sovereign government. So I cannot speak about this on behalf of any government which are not a part of this institution. But let me reiterate our position that this bank is an international multilateral development bank and is open to all the members of the World Bank and ADB. Frankly speaking, as you know, if you are a member of the World Bank or ADB, you are a member of the OMFIF, right? So the membership is open. And once the door is flung open, it will remain that way. But indeed, when you talk about this, let me share some information with you. For instance, over the last 5 years, we have engaged the United States regulatory bodies, and we keep extensive contacts with American government, regulatory bodies, and in particular, we have very productive cooperation with American financial institutions. Bank New York Mellon is a dollar clearing bank, and Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Citigroup served as the joint lead for our global dollar issuance. And Goldman and BlackRock and others serve as our asset managers. So we engage quite a number of American institutions, and we encourage American real sector businesses to participate in international competitive bidding. Now, those who know about the rules of Bretton Woods institutions and all those institutions which pattern themselves on the Bretton Woods institutions, that they know that the staff must be the nationals of the members. And if you want to compete for international competitive bidding, you must be a company of the country which is a member. This is not the case in our institution. We have Americans working here in our bank. We have Japanese, and some of the people are taking very senior positions. I have an American and I have British national in my office, in the president's office. I often say, look, we have an American in the nerve center of this bank. They have access to all of the information because, you see, we are doing something in the global interests. There's nothing to hide. And I remember Winston Churchill told an American counterpart that we Britain have nothing to hide. You see, so we have nothing to hide from the rest of the world.
Oh, Churchill also said that jaw is better than war. So we might bring that into it as well. Are you actually saying the Americans were totally exaggerated and misinformed 6 or 7 years ago, or are you saying that you actually did take note of some of these governance concerns that were voiced at the time, and that you have actually taken on board some of the criticisms that were made, perhaps exaggerated criticisms, but you've taken them on board nonetheless, and you've made sure that this is transparent and not overly Chinese-dominated institution?
You see, David, when the bank was being conceptualized, and when I was called on to take over the job of setting up this bank, I know full well that there were skeptics and some people would have serious misgivings about the dominance of China. And a very good friend of mine who's an American and told me, he came to my office when I was chairman of CICC. He said, Mr. Jin, don't do it. I said, why? He said, you know, you have enjoyed a very good reputation over the last 4 decades. Don't destroy it. I said, I don't understand. How could I destroy my reputation? How could I ruin my reputation simply by doing this? And he said, this is going to be a China bank in the name of a multilateral institution. And I looked him in his eyes and said, I don't think so. You see, how can you build trust? It's not by your words, it's by your deeds. So I laughed away. I laughed away all this kind of skepticism. I remember Jane Austen said, she said, I think selfishness must be forgiven because there's no cure of it. And I said, well, let me paraphrase Jane Austen. Skepticism should be forgiven because there's no cure of it. But how can we do that? I often said, trust has to be earned. Credibility has to be earned and maintained. You cannot talk people into believing you. You cannot talk to people, no matter how eloquent you are, people don't believe you.
Well, I think there's something in the Bible about that, isn't there? By your deeds,
right.
shall you be valued. But can we just come on to this question of corporate culture? Because I know, as you've said, you're very keen that you do have a blending of international talents. Can you describe where you think the corporate culture is now and why you think it might develop further? Where would you like the culture to be, say, in 5 years' time?
We are in the process of building a strong corporate culture. I would say it's an international corporate culture, a corporate culture which is fit for an international institution. Now, I know, actually, as the chairman or the CEO of an institution, mostly people would focus very much on the business, which is important. But you know, culture is the most critical aspect for any institution. If you could have very good culture, if the people enjoy working here, if they enjoy the institution, you have no worries about their commitment, their devotion, their hardworking, and they would bring their talents into full play. So how do we define culture, corporate culture? I think the first of all, as a multilateral development bank, we should all be conscious of the fundamental responsibility. We serve in the interest of the institution in general, and each and every members in particular, impartial to each and every member. But you see, this is not that easy because as senior management members, they come from country A or country B. I'm chairman, I'm the president, I come from China. And I think as a Chinese, I certainly would work in the interest of China. I would be lying if I say, I don't love China, I'm not working for China. I do. But in what way I work for China? As the Chinese national leading this multilateral institution to run this bank as a truly multilateral institution in every sense of the word is the way I work for China.
Well, presumably, your successor, if you ever do step down, you may go on and on and on, of course, will presumably be a non-Chinese national. Can you comment on that? That's a question that's being put to me already in the chat box. Who will be your successor?
You see, first of all, let me see, all the senior management members come from, for instance, we have vice president from UK, from Germany. We used to have a vice president from France, and we have vice president from India and Indonesia. We used to have a vice president from Korea. They are all very senior people, and they are part of the decision-making body, right? So in my view, by my logic, if they work for this institution, they work in the spirit of a multilateral institution, they also serve their own country. Okay, this is a spirit which should be shared by the rank and file. Now, China, as the biggest shareholder, accounting for 30% of the shareholding, with 26.06% of the voting power. So it's only natural China would attach great importance to the healthy development of this bank. So it's all right for us to say, yes, China want to have a big influence on this institution. It's not sin. It's all right. But when you look at the performance of the bank over the last 5 years, China has not meddled with the management of this bank. It's left in the hands of the senior management members.
So you don't get late night calls from President Xi then, President Jin?
Yeah, China has a director on the board, and China could work through the director to express its views on a number of issues. Now, not long ago, I had this same kind of a dialogue with a German think tank, and they were surprised to see that India is the biggest borrower. India's borrowing from this bank accounts for more than 25%. We were surprised. I said, why are you surprised about? I think this is against the backdrop of the border tension between India and China, right? And the business of supporting India and other members went on without any disruption for all the borders spat over this period. I think this is a clear evidence that this bank works in the spirit of a multilateral institution. But why people are surprised?
Sorry to interrupt, but you've made a lot in the last 5 years, and rightly so, of the impressive amount of collaboration you have with the Bretton Woods institutions and also with the Asian Development Bank. Can you give in a rather succinct way your balance sheet of how easy it is to work in a collaborative spirit with the IMF and the World Bank on the one hand and the Asia Development Bank on the other? Can you give a few summing up points, a few highlights of how well that collaboration has worked?
From day one, we cooperated with the World Bank, ADB, and also to a certain extent EBRD. This is because, first of all, we have the same standards, environmental, social standards. So that's the basis for our cooperation. And in spite of the, for instance, skepticism on the part of some American politicians, we started to work from day one with the World Bank, and it's welcome by all of the members. So I think facts speaks louder, and nobody would have any questions about that anymore, because the bank is not supposed to cut the ground from under the feet of the World Bank or ADB. So I would say international cooperation among all MDBs is the hallmark of our cooperation.
Now, let's get on to infrastructure, which is after all the key point here. And also, I've got quite a lot of questions already in the chat function. Please do keep the questions coming in for the second half of the meeting. But you're all about infrastructure. We're always being told about this great big infrastructure gap that there is in Asia. It never seems to get any smaller every year. And I know that the pandemic may have slowed things down a bit in terms of closing the gap. But by combining forces with the private sector as well as the official sector, what do you expect to do in a very concrete way to close this famous Asia infrastructure gap?
I would say infrastructure gap exists not just in Asia, but in other parts of the world. So we will also try to work with other MDBs, particularly when it comes to supporting infrastructure in Latin America, Africa, or Central Eastern European countries. But you see, David, even in developed countries, infrastructure needs upgrading. And I was horrified to see the bridge collapse at rush hour in Minnesota, more two decades ago or something like that. Obviously, a lot of the infrastructure facilities in developed countries were very much neglected, and the maintenance was not insufficient. So it's not simply an issue for developing countries, but of course, the infrastructure gap in developing countries is certainly more serious. But when we focus on infrastructure, I want to highlight a couple of points. First of all, this is the infrastructure for tomorrow, infrastructure built with new technology, particularly digital technology, infrastructure which was built with a high sense of environmental protection, climate change mitigation, and particularly to take care of the people who would otherwise be affected by the infrastructure projects. We pay attention to the gender balance. We pay attention to the job creations for women. So infrastructure developed today should be different from the way it was developed 20, 30, 40 years ago. Secondly, I think there's one point which was missed by a lot of people. The bank's mandate is to promote the wealth creation, economic, social development of our members through investment in infrastructure and other productive sectors. So when we were in a negotiation period, I put this concept, infrastructure and other productive sectors. So people asked me at that time, said, Mr. Jin, what do you mean by other productive sectors? And I said, other productive sectors means other productive sectors, right? We don't want to focus on infrastructure which is defined in a very narrow manner. Now, 5 years on, we see, how about healthcare? Healthcare is social infrastructure. A sick nation is never productive. You can build huge amount of infrastructure facilities, but when people are locked down, when you could not deal with pandemic, all these infrastructure facilities would come to nothing.
So does this mean, for example, that you'll be collaborating very firmly with other countries in building post-pandemic resilience and also maybe helping the Chinese government to explore more fully the reasons for the outbreak of the COVID virus, which many people believe, I think rightly, did start in China?
You see, with regard to the origin of the virus, I think it's a controversial issue because scientists don't see eye to eye with each other. But what is important is not to pin it down to certain location. I think what is important for all of us to work together to harness this pandemic. But I think this would also mean a big step forward in building the social infrastructure. I would say that in the future, probably more resources will be allocated for for instance, the research, R&D for prevention of pandemic diseases and to increase the capacity to respond to the pandemic whenever it crops up. And you see, when you look at the speed of developing vaccine, this is unprecedented throughout the history. We know it normally takes a decade or even 20 years to develop the vaccines. Polio, I think it took 15 years. And
you will be contributing to this, will you? With the resources of the AIIB, you'll be contributing to the further acceleration of this effort.
certainly would try to help this country deal with COVID-19. And we are also contemplating supporting the countries in the efforts to purchase the vaccines. In this regard, we would be working with the World Bank and ADB, but it's very much important for us to make sure that the money which would be spent on the vaccines would go to the right place. And we want to provide support to those countries who can get vaccines which are certified by the for instance, WHO, by the regulatory bodies. And also we want to make sure the procurement of vaccines would be done in a proper way. So anyway, I think it's important. Now, when we discuss this on the board, for instance, when we propose CRF, Crisis Recovery Facility, we allocate first $500 million, then $1 billion, then we increase to $1.3 million. It's a lot of money. And we told the board that momentarily we would focus on dealing with the COVID-19 because a lot of countries could not free their hand to continue with the traditional infrastructure projects. Let's deal with the COVID-19 and they come back to the mainstream business. But even after the COVID-19 is brought under control, we should allocate a proper amount of resources for health sector, which is the weakest link on the global production
that's
chain.
very good to know.
That's right.
Just two more quick questions from me, and then I'll go on to two from the audience. I will have Clive Hallwood and Julian Kello in a moment. Just first question from me. Have you had any contact in the last few weeks with the Biden administration about the future of multilateralism in the post-Trump world?
You see, I have a lot of friends who are either Democrats or Republicans, and we have also Americans who served on the International Advisory Panel, and we have also very senior people such as finance, risk management, and they are reaching out to the officials in an informal way. So we hope we can we make our bank better understood by the new administration. Fortunately, we do have a lot of people in the United States who know about this bank over the last 7 years, 2 years of preparation plus 5 years of operation. So I don't think there's any disruption in our communication with American friends in think tanks, for instance. And
this is more indirect than direct.
Yeah, I think it's going very well.
Good.
It's going very well.
That's helpful. The second question before we go on to the audience is that you mentioned the cash-strapped developing countries. You mentioned privatizations. Where do you stand on the restructuring of some of the loans to, say, some poorer countries in Africa and in Asia? Will the AIIB be taking part in any of this restructuring? China itself is going to become quasi a member of the Paris Club. What will the AIIB's contribution be to this debt restructuring that we're talking about these days?
For the bilateral donors, I think it's certainly important for them to engage the debtor countries, try to help them deal with the pandemic, which certainly means the heavy pressure on their public balance sheet. With regard to multilateral development banks, Bretton Woods institutions, as you know, they enjoy the preferred credit status, they enjoy the AAA rating. So any move in that regard should be done cautiously. To my knowledge, probably the World Bank, ADB, with their soft window, may consider certain measures to, for instance, suspend the payment for a certain time. But we are fully aware of the important point that as a multilateral development institution, our job is to provide fresh new money at a time when the debtor countries need resources. So if we, the multilateral development banks, have problems with the rating companies, even though it's the perceived problem, that would impact directly on our market perception. That would raise the costs of the funding. Ultimately, it would boomerang against the borrowing countries. Yes. Our bank is very new, and we have $22 billion of lending and mostly undispersed. So we don't think it's an issue for us. But I would like to say, if we look at the history, recent history, the debt problem does not come from the amount of debt incurred by a country. Debt problems comes from the mismanagement of the resources of the debt. If
I can see that you will make a big impact on that. Well, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to hurry us on a little bit because we've got a dozen questions and we're going to have to hurry through the next 25 minutes. Clive Hallwood, could you put your question quite succinctly, please? And also, Mr. Jin, I can ask you to also reply in a fairly pithy fashion. Clive.
Okay.
Clive, it seems, he can't put his question directly. So he is saying that Swiss Re has estimated that there's something like 80 to 85 trillion dollars under management in the private sector that could be used for developing country infrastructure development under the right conditions. So how do we unlock that tremendous amount of money, Mr. Jin, which is sitting out there in the private sector asset management field?
First of all, I think the multilateral development banks like ours can facilitate the whole process. We want to work with the private sector. We want to crowd in the private sector to invest in infrastructure by our close relationship with the borrowing countries. So our job is to set up a very good platform so that private sector investors can invest. With the multilateral development banks in place, I think the private sector companies would feel more comfortable. But this is a huge amount of resources. They are chasing too few very, very good projects. So even though we do not have direct impact on the policy issues of those countries, like the World Bank, but we do make a point of communicating with the government, asking them to improve the investment climate and be consistent in their policies to help the private sector investors. So we, as I said, by 2030, we want to have 50% of the lending in the private sector. This is a wonderful opportunity for them.
Good. Julian Callow, can you come in now with your question? Otherwise, I can put it directly. Julian, can you switch on your microphone and your camera? If not, I will just go straight into the question from Julian Callow, which is, what about your strategy for renewable energy? How are you going to, in a very direct way, contribute to the challenging fight against climate change?
We have a new corporate strategy approved by the board October last year, and we made it very much clear we will ramp up our efforts to support renewable energy to deal with climate change. We reach 50% of the climate financing by 2025, which is only 5 years away. But we make it very much clear we are not going to do any coal-related projects, no coal-firing projects, no projects which are functionally related to coal. So we focus on limited resources on renewables. But you see, the multilateral development banks' resources are always limited. But we serve as the beacon. We serve as the guide for the developing countries. We help them focus their limited resources on renewables. And I hope because of the enhanced investment in the renewables, you see very quickly, we see the new technology. And even so, for instance, the solar arrays, which are far more productive than what it used to be. So my view is, as long as we focus on renewables, there will be new technology coming up. There will be the better ways to promote the energy, renewable energy. But on the other hand, we should also try to invest in energy efficient projects, energy saving projects, which is also important. For instance, mass transit system. Now, if we can improve the subway, the mass transit system, people don't have to drive in their individual cars. So that's also a way. So we look at the climate finance mitigation in a broad manner.
Collaboration with the private sector is enormously important, as it is also with the official sector. I've got several questions about this collaboration. I'll paraphrase a couple of these. What is the ideal split between risk capital and bond finance in a typical case? Let's say for a renewable energy project where there clearly is a lot of risk involved. What would you say to the questioner who puts that particular point?
I think you see, for the renewables, unless the people invest in the latest state-of-art technology with unproven record, probably it's a little bit risky. But if we put resources in the renewables, the technology was being with us for a decade or with proven record, I don't think the risk is very high. But for the investors, I think we have different kind of investors. For instance, for venture capitalists, they probably would be willing to invest in riskier projects with new technology. And for those who would like to have steady cash flow, who do not want to risk their capital, they can invest in those projects which certainly would pose less risks. So, for instance, for the bond investors, I think if the proceeds of the bonds could support a project, renewables, with a reasonable longer maturity, it would help the project sponsor to complete the project in time and start to generate revenues. So I would say that the investors in the pretty long term, not too long, long-term 5-year, 10-year kind of a bond would definitely have a very good returns. But I do believe we need some venture capitalists who would be willing to invest in new technologies. So I think
it's going to be a mixture, I think.
Yeah,
Several questions have come in. Several questions have come in on the Belt and Road. I know that is a separate undertaking, and the AIIB is not primarily concerned with the Belt and Road. Nonetheless, there are some overlaps. One questioner asks, what is the general cooperation with the Belt and Road strategy? Another questioner says, there are some people who think the Belt and Road strategy has led to over-indebtedness by some countries who are recipients of Chinese loans from that mechanism. You said earlier that in fact it's not over-indebtedness, it's mismanagement that leads to problems. Do you share any of those criticisms that have been made about the Belt and Road lending strategy?
I think I would say probably the Chinese authorities could continue to clarify the issues with regard to the correlation of debt and the Belt and Road. And personally, I don't think it is true, because you see, 4 decades ago, when I was started to be involved in the multilateral development bank issues, we talk about debt, right? 40 years ago in the 1980s, all the way when China was still a very low-income country, debt problems were there. And almost in each and every annual meeting of the World Bank and IMF, they were talking about debt suspension, all these kind of issues. It's not new. And if you look at the Belt and Road programs, which was initiated by China 5 years ago, how could all those debt be incurred by this program? It's certainly not right. So I think people should really look at the data and be really analytical with regard to real problems of the debt. And with regard to the bank's relationship in Belt and Road, as you know, it is, I think probably some people don't know, we don't pick projects for any of the members from the list of the Chinese institutions. The way we manage the bank goes like this. We process projects proposed to us by the member countries, governments, project sponsors, or private sector investors. So when they, for instance, when India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, or Russia, or Indonesia, when they came to us, they gave us the projects. Then we have the screening committee. We look at all these projects to see whether we can process them. So this is the initiation of the projects of the pipeline. Now, if they tell us this is the Belt Road project, that's fine. If they tell us this is not the Belt Road project, that's fine either, because we propose the projects by our practice. Only those projects which the borrowing countries want to do on their own. Now, if we know that probably a road in some country is Belt Road project, that's fine. We welcome that. And we want to do a good job to make sure the Belt Road project proposed to us would be done by very high standards, meeting the environment, social standards. And we don't want to see projects of this will lead to social problems.
How many of these projects do you actually turn down because they don't meet the right standards? Can you give us an idea of that?
Actually, I would say we don't really turn down the projects. We only pick the projects we think we can do. If you give me 10 projects, for instance, if a particular countries give me 10 projects, I will find maybe 3 or 4 or 5 projects. Oh, these projects which we can do, right? For the other projects, we may not be able to process anytime soon.
That gives an idea. A questioner has asked about Indonesia, clearly a huge country in your region. Can you say a few words about your collaboration with the Indonesia Investment Authority?
We do sovereign loans. We also do private sector loans in Indonesia. And I think it depends on who initiates a particular project. But you see, Indonesia, in my view, is a country with a great potential. But since it's an archipelago, the connectivity is really a big problem. And while they sit on large coal mines or gas reserves, and to tap the renewable energy sources is also very much important. So I'm very happy about our cooperation with Indonesia. But we also do something with a long-term impact. For instance, we co-financed the slums upgrading project in Indonesia with the World Bank. We want to improve the urban infrastructure, improving the environment, and reduce the poverty and reduce the incidence of the malaria or this kind of epidemic. So it's very good, I think, cooperation. We do not just enjoy this with the particular institutions in Indonesia. We also enjoy our cooperation with the World Bank.
You've given a very bottom-up view of how you do your projects. The projects come in from several countries, and then you sort them out. Several questions have asked me to put questions to you about how this will look in coming years. I can see that you don't have a master plan for this because it's partly reflects on the project demand. But one questioner says, could you give an idea about how these investments will be distributed in different countries in Asia? You mentioned up to now, India has been the biggest borrower, for example. Will that continue, do you think? And also, can you give a rough distribution, the questioner asks, amongst the different types of infrastructure, renewables against traditional power, transport, telecoms, healthcare, and so on? Can you give a quick view on that, please, Mr. Jin?
Yes. I think the demand coming from the borrowing countries are mostly in areas of transportation, energy, and these are the two most, I think, important sectors for most of these countries. Of course, transport covers a lot of areas, and we certainly do the roads, and we will also we did roads and the ports, and we would also try to do the airports and rapid rail in the future. So rural roads, we did one project in India. So transportation covers a lot of areas. Energy, as I said, we will focus on renewables in the future. And also we do finance the banking sector because you see, we do infrastructure projects of certain size, and it's not cost effective for us to do smaller infrastructure projects, which might be important. So we work through the private equity funds, or sometimes it's government sponsored equity funds like India's National Infrastructure Fund. And that way we can help the developing countries to deal with the vast array of infrastructure development needs through the intermediaries. And we also on-lend to the project sponsor through our engagement with the banking sector. So this is very much innovative, and we also finance the institutional investors. We buy their bonds, they commit to us, they would put these resources in renewables. So ESG kind of standard. So we offer products which cover more areas than the traditional development banks.
This is your asset management activity, isn't it? Which has actually increased a lot in the last few years. In fact, I'm going to now blend together several questions which do relate to asset management as well. One is very much on the blended finance question. How directly are you going to increase the participation of the private sector in your operations to 50% by 2030? Can you give us some concrete ideas on that? And secondly, a questioner says, what is your contribution going to be towards green finance in Asia, to the extent that you may start to introduce some new products in your asset management vehicle, for example? Will you be playing a big role in actual product development in green finance? Thank you.
We, as you see, we are trying to be open-minded. I don't think we should be stuck in the very narrow definition of the financing for infrastructure, as I said. And we have tried new approaches through the financial sector, and in so doing, we can also promote the bond market in developing countries. You see, a number of developing countries have lots of liquidity sitting there doing nothing just because they don't have the mechanism. So this is what we want to contribute. And I believe through our very active approach, we can engage more private sectors to invest in the infrastructure for tomorrow. Indeed, when we work with the private sector, they could feel more comfortable because when we are over there, when we are the co-investor, the government will take us very seriously. And we also want to make sure that the things would be going well, and there will be no corruption, no misappropriation of the resources. So all this would be enhancing the confidence of private sector. So as you see, we are doing a lot. And I personally, I think our support for the infrastructure through the financial sector, through the banking sector and private equity fund would make a lot of difference.
And on this green finance question.
Green finance, yes, of course. You see,
new products here?
You see, we would, as I said, we are open. If there are some new products, some new technology, we'll be very much willing to look at the feasibility of those projects. So keeping open-minded, I think, is the best way to deal with the challenge which would be coming up in the future, because you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And what is, I think the drawback of some of those people is that they think, oh, this is something which we have never done, so we shouldn't do it. For instance, for instance, when we start to support the countries in dealing with COVID-19, some people say, your bank for infrastructure, you have no technology whatsoever to deal with the health sector. We did it with great success. So I would say, first of all, we should have confidence in ourselves. We should be able to develop our in-house capability. We can also work with the external partners. And there are lots of ways for us to achieve.
So your door is always open to imaginative ideas. Right. I'm going to just bring in two more questions before we have to close in a couple of minutes. And I apologize to those who I haven't been able to squeeze in. First question, where do you see the means for novel digital monetary and financial tools to help bring in the private sector to a greater extent in climate change finance in coming years?
On this issue, I would say we are still in a learning process. We push for digital transition. We push for digital technology. And in many countries, actually, this is also the big gap. We call it digital divide. And fintech can also, I think, make a lot of difference in the future. But how can we work with the digital technology companies, with those who have resources? I think this is certainly a challenge.
So if anybody is listening with any bright ideas, they can send messages to your office and you will deal with them. Final question. You mentioned very impressively the huge number of American institutions that you're working with. And of course, the dollar is the unit of account. That's the reference currency. Mm-hmm. Any thought that that might change either in 5 years or in 10 years? You might go to the renminbi. Do you have any thoughts on how the renminbi may be challenging the dollar in coming decades as the future supreme world currency? That's one of the questions, very exotic question from one of our listeners.
I think as a fast rising economy, Chinese currency RMB would play a bigger role moving forward in international settlement. However, it will take years and decades for the RMB to do more in the international transactions vis-a-vis the United States. I would say US dollar would remain the currency for international settlements, for trade, investment, and that will not change. And people erroneously propose some ideas that probably RMB would replace US dollar. I don't think probably that kind of view would be shared by a lot of economists, but we have to acknowledge, as a fast developing country, Chinese currency would play a bigger role, but that does not mean RMB would replace United States dollar, which is not, I think, the case. I don't think
might the renminbi be playing a bigger role in some of your financing operations on both sides of your balance sheet?
So far, we are offering US dollar and local currency transactions. For instance, we issue Indian or Indonesia, all these kind of currencies to meet the needs, and we help them manage the currency swaps. So it's the local currency financing, which was done by ADB or the World Bank or other institutions. This does not mean those local currencies replace the US dollar, which is not true, right? So since our borrowers would like to have their own currencies, local currency, we finance that. The first RMB bond we issued, 3 billion RMB, was used to finance the COVID-19 projects in China, right? So we can call it local currency because we borrowed RMB and spend RMB to help China to deal with COVID-19. But since RMB is one currency in the IMF basket, you can also say this is the international currency, it's not a local currency. But anyway, and I think US dollar would continue to play and a very important role in international settlements, and that will not change. But I think actually, when RMB takes a greater role, that would be very good to help release the pressure on the United States. And we all know about Triffin dilemma, and probably dilemma would be eased because some other countries' currencies would be of some help.
Yeah, well, thank you for that very balanced and diplomatic answer, which I think encapsulates your commitment to multilateralism. We've come to the end of our hour. It's gone very quickly. You've given us a picture, I think, of a bank that is open to new ideas and is very willing to work very, very closely, not just with the other official institutions, but with the private sector. I'm sure many of the listeners will be writing into you, Mr. Jin, to offer their help and support and encouragement. You've also done this in a marvelous way, because I know that you learnt your English while listening to the BBC. And I must say, you could easily have had a second career as a BBC presenter, because you present in a very pithy, very solemn, but also very informative manner. So many thanks. Maybe that will be your job in the future when you finally do retire, that you could work for the BBC. I think that would be a fantastic way of adding another tier to your marvelous career.
I gave interviews to BBC lots of times. I had a hard talk with Steve Sachs, you know. Yes. I enjoy working with them. But you see, I learned English the British way as a teenager. And even though I stayed quite a number of years in the United States, I still read a lot of British, publications, including fiction.
Well, that's right. Well, we are, as you know, two countries divided by a common language. So on that linguistic note, may I say many thanks, good luck in your next 5 years, and we wish you a great deal of support and encouragement from all over the world for all your endeavors. So thank you very much for talking to us, Mr. Jin.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much.